Montana Territory. January 1878, the wind came down from the Bitterroot Range without asking permission. It moved in long, low sheets across the valley floor, pressing against every cabin wall, hunting for cracks, finding them. By the second week of January 1878, the temperature at the foot of the Sapphire Mountains had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius during the day and plunged to minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 20 degrees Celsius after dark. Snow didn't fall so much as accumulate. Quietly, without drama, the way serious cold always works. From the trail that ran along the eastern ridge, a traveler would have seen a dozen homesteads scattered across the valley. Most of them were unremarkable. Square-hewn log cabins, single-room affairs with stone chimneys pushing white smoke into gray sky, wood piles stacked against south-facing walls, smoke curling from every roof. One cabin, however, sat further back from the others, tucked behind a woodshed, half hidden by a stand of lodgepole pine. It was smaller than its neighbors. Its walls were lower. From a distance, it looked like the least likely shelter to survive a Montana winter. From the inside, it was a different story entirely. Nobody on that valley had fully understood what was happening inside that cabin. Not yet. But by the time the storms of February 1879 had passed, nearly every family within 4 miles would be asking questions and copying answers from a woman who had never once claimed to know what she was doing. Her name was Hester Crane, and she had started by digging a hole. If you've ever wondered how the old settlers kept warm with so little, stay with this channel. Subscribe now, because every week we uncover a real technique that worked when life depended on it. Hit the bell. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's get into it. Hester Crane was 31 years old when her husband, Thomas, died of a chest sickness in the autumn of 1876. He left her 2 children, a girl of 7 named Claire and a boy of 5 named Eli, one unfinished cabin, a team of horses that were getting old, and a woodpile that would last, if she was careful, through mid-February. She had not come west to be a pioneer story. She had come west because Thomas had convinced her there was good grazing land in the valley and cheap timber on the ridgeline. Both things turned out to be true. Neither of them had planned for Thomas to be gone before the second winter. The first winter alone, she had managed, barely. She fed the fire every 3 to 4 hours a night, wrapped the children in every blanket she owned, and burned through the woodpile 2 weeks faster than she had estimated. By March, she was burning furniture legs. By April, the snow had melted enough that she could drag deadfall from the tree line herself, 1 log at a time. That summer, she made a decision. She would not spend another winter counting sticks. What Hester had noticed, not as a theory but as a lived experience, was that the cold didn't come through the walls. Not mostly. It came through the floor. It came under the door. It came wherever air could move freely between outside and inside. The fire in the center of the cabin radiated heat in every direction equally, and most of it went straight up and out through the chimney or sideways into the log walls and disappeared into the night. The room warmed for an hour after good fire. Then the chill crept back. She also noticed something else. Behind the woodshed, where she stacked the previous year's cut, the ground never froze as deep. The wood on the bottom of the pile, resting against the earth, stayed drier than the wood stacked in the open. The soil held something, a faint, persistent warmth that the air above it did not. She didn't have a word for it. No one in the valley did. What Hester Crane had stumbled onto was the oldest principle of passive thermal architecture in human history. The earth is a battery. She picked up a shovel. The project began in late August 1877, after the first hard frost had reminded her that summer in Montana is a borrowed season. What Hester built, or rather dug, was not a single dramatic invention. It was a series of small, stubborn modifications, each one solving a specific problem she had identified the winter before. Taken together, they formed what a modern building scientist might call a passive thermal envelope. Hester called it making the cold work less. The first element was the earthen gallery. Behind the woodshed, which already sat on the north side of the cabin, serving as a windbreak, Hester dug a covered trench approximately 14 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, about 4.3 m times 0.9 m times 0.6 m. She lined the bottom with flat stones pulled from the creek bed. She roofed it with a frame of lodgepole poles, then packed that frame with a foot 30 centimeters of compacted soil, dead grass, and pine duff, the same loose organic matter that carpet a forest floor and insulates it naturally. The trench connected the rear wall of the woodshed directly to the back wall of the cabin through a low-crawl entrance. The purpose was simple. Any air entering the cabin from outside, whether through the door, through gaps in the log chinking, or by natural draft, had to pass first through that underground gallery before reaching the living space. The earth around the trench maintained a temperature of roughly 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, even in the deepest Montana cold, compared to outside air that could reach minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius in January. The gallery pre-tempered incoming air. It didn't heat the cabin. It prevented the cabin from being actively robbed of warmth every time cold air crept in. The second element was the stone wall, along the north-facing interior wall of the cabin. The wall most exposed cold, Hester mortar flat sandstone and limestone slabs she had carried from a creek outcrop roughly a quarter-mile away. The finished wall was 8 inches thick, about 20 centimeters, floor to ceiling, set tight against the existing log wall. It weighed somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds, 225 to 315 kilograms, in total, according to a rough estimate based on the stone dimensions she described in a letter to her sister in Ohio, preserved in a county archive. Stone, particularly sandstone and limestone, has a specific heat capacity roughly 3 times higher than dry wood and more than 4 times higher than air. What this means in practical terms: the stone wall absorbed heat from the fire during the hours the fire burned hot, stored the way a cast iron skillet stores heat long after you've taken off the flame. Then, over the 6 to 10 hours after the fire died down or was banked low for the night, the wall slowly released that stored heat back into the room. It was not a dramatic system. The stone didn't glow. It didn't crackle. It sat there heavy and gray, and quietly kept the temperature from dropping as fast as it otherwise would have. The third modification was simpler still. A secondary was stored inside the covered gallery, where split firewood rested in the tempered underground air. Wet or freshly cut wood is notoriously difficult to ignite and burns inefficiently, releasing more smoke than heat. By storing a 3-day supply of wood in the gallery, insulated from both rain and the worst freezing, Hester ensured that the wood she fed her fire each morning was consistently drier than anything her neighbors were burning. From the outside, what people saw was a muddy trench behind the woodshed, a strange low tunnel connecting 2 outbuildings, and a wall covered in lumpy creek stone. Nobody was impressed. Marcus Delrue ran the supply post at the south end of the valley. He was not an unkind man. He extended credit when families ran short and kept reasonable prices on nails and lamp oil, but he had strong opinions about how things ought to be done on the frontier, and he shared them freely. When he stopped by Hester's property in early September 1877 to deliver a bag of cornmeal she had ordered, he stood for a long moment looking at the trench behind the woodshed, then at the low stone wall visible through the open cabin door, then back at the trench. "You're burying your house," he said. Hester told him the trench would pre-warm incoming air and the stone wall would hold heat through the night. Delrue looked at the stone wall again. "You put 400 pounds of cold rock inside a cabin you're trying to keep warm," he said. "That's going to draw the chill right out of the floor." He wasn't being cruel. He was applying a logic that made intuitive sense. Cold things make rooms colder. What he didn't account for, what almost no one in the valley would have accounted for, was the difference between a cold object and a thermally massive object. Once its stone wall reached equilibrium with the interior of the cabin, it would stop absorbing cold and start storing heat. The same property that made it feel cold to the touch in September would make it radiate warmth in January. Hester didn't argue. She thanked him for the cornmeal. A neighboring farmer's wife, passing on horseback a week later, looked at the covered gallery and said it reminded her of a root cellar dug wrong. A young trapper who had been using the Southern Trail regularly that fall paused long enough to say it looked like a mud house for someone who didn't trust themselves indoors. He meant it as a joke. Hester smiled and went back to mortaring stone. Nobody tried to stop her. They simply didn't believe it would work. And because they didn't believe it, they didn't bother investing much energy in opposition. Indifference on the frontier was its own kind of verdict. By the end of October 1877, the gallery was complete, the stone wall was set, and what store inside was stacked with 3 weeks of split pine, already beginning to dry in the tempered air underground. Hester banked the fire, put the children to bed, and waited for winter. She did not wait long. The blizzard arrived on January 14th, 1879. It did not announce itself. The morning had been clear and brutally cold. -8 degrees Fahrenheit, -22 degrees Celsius by midday, but skies on the east in front of the sapphires could turn in under 2 hours, and by 3 in the afternoon the first wall of snow had closed the valley. By nightfall, visibility was 0. By the following morning, drifts had sealed 3 cabin doors on the north side of the valley from the outside. The storm held for 11 days. Not 11 days of blizzard. Montana weather moves in waves, not walls, but 11 days of sustained cold, driving wind, intermittent snow, and temperatures that refused to climb above 10 degrees Fahrenheit, -12 degrees Celsius even at midday. It was a kind of extended cold that exhausted firewood supplies, froze well ropes, and turned even well-chinked log cabins into chambers of slow, grinding discomfort. The valley's families began to struggle in different ways and at different speeds. 2 homesteads to the north of Hester's property burned through their accessible wood piles by the 5th day. They were stacked outside, but much of it had been buried under drift, and the pieces they could reach had been soaked by the heavy wet snow that fell on the 3rd night before the temperature dropped again and locked everything in ice. Wet wood burns poorly. It produces more steam than flame, and the incomplete combustion coats chimney flues with creosote faster, restricting draft. Within a day of switching to wet wood, the chimney in the Alderman cabin, directly east of Hester's, began to backdraft. Smoke rolled back into the room. The family opened windows to ventilate, which invited more cold air, which required more fire, which produced more smoke. They were caught in a loop that had no good exit. A widow named Marit Selsby, whose cabin sat a half-mile to the west, ran out of interior firewood on the 7th day. Her outdoor pile was accessible but cold, -14 degrees Fahrenheit, -26 degrees Celsius overnight, and the wood refused to take a flame readily. She spent 3 hours on the 8th morning coaxing a fire out of frozen pine with strips of cloth soaked in rendered fat. It worked eventually, but for 3 hours her cabin was unheated. The interior temperature dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. A water bucket by the door froze solid. Inside Hester's cabin, the fire burned slow and low. The stone wall did not feel particularly warm to the touch. It never did, but it released heat the way a deep cold does, steadily, without drama, through the entire night. Hester fed the fire twice between sundown and sunrise, rather than the 4 or 5 times she had managed the previous winter. The wood from the underground gallery caught easily every time, dry and split fine, the kindling crumbling apart the way good season should. The gallery's pretempered air came in at the back wall. Cool, yes, but not the lung-seizing -20 degrees Fahrenheit air that her neighbors were inhaling through their gaps and cracks. Clara and Eli slept through most of it. Hester read by the fire and waited. Stay with this video, because in a moment, you're going to see the number that left the whole valley without a word. Subscribe if you haven't. This is the kind of knowledge they stopped teaching when we stopped needing to survive winter on our own. It was a man named Gus Alderman who first started comparing notes. Alderman was not a sentimental man or a curious one by nature. He was a practical farmer who had been forced, on the 8th night of the blizzard, to bring his family across the snow to Hester's cabin after the backdrafting situation in his own home became untenable. He spent 2 nights there, he and his wife and their 3 children, sleeping on the floor near Hester's stone wall, wrapped in their own bedding. What he noticed was the temperature. His own cabin, which he had built the summer before with good quality timber and tight chinking, had dropped to somewhere near 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. On the mornings he had returned to check on it during the storm. This after the fire had been burning the previous evening. It was survivable, barely, cold enough that the children couldn't sleep without shivering, cold enough that water standing in a basin overnight would be skimmed with ice by morning. Hester's cabin, on the mornings after a fire had been banged to low overnight, maintained what Alderman later described to the supply trader Delru as around 58, maybe 60 degrees, roughly 58 to 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 to 16 degrees Celsius. He had a small thermometer, a simple alcohol instrument he used to track overnight lows for planting records. He hung it inside Hester's cabin on the second night at 6 in the morning. With the fire reduced to embers, it read 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius. His own cabin, measured the same morning under similar fire conditions, read 37 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. The difference, 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, with the fire in roughly equivalent states, was not a small variance. It was not explainable by cabin size, with quality or insulation differences alone. Something structural was working differently in Hester's cabin. Alderman, to his credit, asked questions. Hester walked him through it with the patience of someone who had thought about nothing else for 18 months. The gallery pre-tempered the air. The stone walls stored heat during peak fire hours and returned it slowly during the low fire hours. The underground would store kept fuel dry and ignition reliable, which meant less time with a cold or struggling fire, and more time with consistent, clean combustion. The numbers Alderman carried back to the valley were simple and memorable. 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer through the night. Roughly 40% less firewood burned over the 11-day storm, compared to his own estimate of what his household had consumed. And Hester's fire had stayed above freezing for more than 8 hours after being fully banked, compared to the 2 hours Alderman had observed in his own structure before temperatures dropped back toward the ambient outdoor cold. 600 pounds of creek stone, a 14-foot underground gallery, split with stored underground. That was the entire system. Marcus Delru was the first asked about the stone thickness. He came by in October 1879, 8 months after the blizzard, with another winter approaching, and stood in front of the north wall for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked how thick the stone was and what kind of mortar she had used. Hester told him, 8 inches of flat-laid sandstone and limestone, mortared with a clay-lime mix she had made herself from creek clay and wood ash lime. He nodded and left without further comment. By November, the stone in the supply post back wall had been extended. The Alderman family began constructing their own earthen gallery that same autumn, though theirs ran only 10 feet rather than 14, and they filled it with creek gravel rather than duff and soil, a variation that oral accounts in the region suggest worked nearly as well, since the gravel's thermal mass compensated for the reduced insulating capacity of the covering. Their firewood store moved inside the gallery by the following December. Marit Selsby, the widow to the west, did something different. She had neither the stones nor the inclination to dig a long gallery, but she did line her north wall with stacked, dry-laid flat stones, no mortar, just weight and mass, and stacked her woodpile against the north exterior wall, creating a secondary windbreak that also kept her accessible with dryer. Local accounts suggest her winter wood consumption dropped measurably that year, though no precise figure survive. By the winter of 1880, at least 4 households in the valley had incorporated some version of Hester's 3-part system. None of them called it by her name. On the frontier, good ideas didn't get credited. They got adopted, modified, and eventually absorbed into the way things were done, as though they had always been done that way. The earthen gallery became, in that valley, simply the crawl between the shed and the house. The stone wall became the heat wall. The underground woodpile became keeping wood right. Hester herself moved to Missoula in 1883, after Clara married a man with a timber claim near the Clark Fork River. She left the cabin and its system behind. The next family to occupy it reportedly kept it running, without modification, for 2 more decades. The trench behind the woodshed filled in slowly, year by year, as the soil settled. But the stone wall stayed. It was still standing, according to a county surveyor's note from 1901, when the property was remapped. He described it as unusual internal stonework of unclear origin. He had no idea. There is a principle in thermal physics that engineers today call thermal lag, the delay between when material absorbs heat and when it releases it back into the surrounding space. Dense, heavy materials like stone, concrete, and rammed earth have a long thermal lag. They absorb slowly and release slowly. A wall with high thermal mass doesn't make a room warm instantly, but it prevents a room from becoming cold quickly. It smooths out the extremes. Hester Crane did not know the term. She knew the feeling, the way the stone in the cabin stayed faintly warm to the touch long after the fire had gone quiet, the way the morning cold never bit as hard as it did in the previous cabin, the way her children woke up warm rather than shivering. What she built was not magic. It was geometry and material science, arrived at through necessity rather than education. The earth beneath the frost line holds a near constant temperature of 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 7 degrees Celsius, across most of the northern temperate zone, a fact that modern ground source heat pump systems are built around, and that frontier builders across multiple cultures had exploited for centuries before Hester's shovel ever broke Montana soil. The Finnish Savasana, the Icelandic turf house, the ancestral Pueblo and cliff dwelling, the Siberian Zemlyanka, all of them, in different materials and different climates, understood the same thing. The ground does not forget warmth the way air does. What modern construction sacrificed in the name of speed, standardization, and cheap fuel was precisely this kind of site-specific, material-honest thinking. Hester's gallery worked because she had paid attention to what the earth behind her woodshed was already doing. The stone wall worked because she had hauled heavy things a quarter mile rather than take the easier path. The underground wood store worked because she had noticed that the bottom of a pile stays drier than the top. None of it was complicated. All of it required time, observation, and the willingness to be thought ridiculous for a season. The lesson is not that old ways are always better. The lesson is that the people who survived the hardest conditions were the ones who watched carefully, thought practically, and refused to let embarrassment override good engineering. Hester Crane watched. She thought. She dug. And her cabin stayed warm. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to get through? Drop it in the comments below. If this kind of real, practical history is what you're here for, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, a technique that worked when I had to,